Welcome everyone to the webinar hosted by the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute. My name is Kara Zakavich and I'm the Child Injury Prevention Coordinator here. So we're pleased to host this webinar, barring that we have a few technical issues, but we'll go forward as is, and hopefully this meeting will be recorded properly and we'll be able to hear everything that happens. So active play does result in some injuries, but the Canadian Pediatric Society states that it is lower than the risk of not participating in terms of overall benefits. And as an organization, we working in injury prevention, the Institute is supportive of promoting active play. So I'm just going to turn it over to Ian and I'll let him introduce himself and his role and start right into the webinar. So here we go. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Cara. Thank you everybody for your time and attending this webinar. I'm really pleased to do this. I first want to acknowledge my colleague, Dr. Mariana Brusoni, who partners with me, and she actually leads our research here on risky active play. But she's currently on sabbatical, so you're having me give this presentation today. I'm a professor in the Department of Pediatrics at UBC, which is located at BC Children's Hospital. And I'm also the director of the BC Injury Research and Prevention Unit. And like many of you, we're very concerned about child and youth injury prevention, but we're also very concerned about their healthy development. And of course, it's finding a balance between healthy development and the risk of injury. And risky play falls within that conversation area. So today's presentation is about risky play. I'm going to ask you, in thinking about risky play, to reflect on your own childhood play. I'm going to talk a little bit about the qualities of play today and risks associated with play. We're going to talk quite specifically then around what risky play is and the benefits. We're going to look at some of the evidence and what might be some of the strategies for change if indeed risky play is something that we should pursue for the health and well-being of children. So what I'd like you to do now at your desk or in your meeting room, wherever you are, is perhaps close your eyes. Take yourself back to when you were about 9, 10, or 11 years of age, and I want you to think about what your childhood play activities were like. What was your favorite thing to do? I mean, ask yourself, what could you not wait to get home to after school and get going on? I want you to imagine where you are. I want you to think about the sights, the sounds, the smells. Think about who is there with you. And I just want you to be in that place for a little while in your own mind with your eyes closed. Think about the play, think about the activities, think about what you were doing. Now, I want you to open your eyes and tell me, did that place look like this? Or did it look like this? Or was it more like this? Or perhaps this place in the mud along the river? Or was it that fantastic tree fort that you built? And notice the little fellow with a very dangerous implement in his hand? Or was it on the rope swing over the river? Or because I lived for 25 years in Saskatchewan as well, was it more like this? Now I want you to ask yourself, what is childhood like now? I want you to think about the activities that children engage in now as play, those things that they can't wait to get to, the things that you just thought about when you were a child. And of course, I want to ask you, are those activities similar to or different from the ones you did? And of course, the question is, why? I'm going to come back to that later on. But let's look at some of the evidence around play today, and whether in fact it is similar or different to what you experienced as a child. So how many of you might identify with this kind of activity? Perhaps the left-hand picture is you as a child, outdoors, passing the ball, fully active, compared to kids nowadays who spend a good deal of their time indoors, online, with an electronic device in their hands. And we do know from research conducted on physical activity that a typical Canadian 12-year-old nowadays, I'm trying to make this work, there we go, young boys in 1981, and I'm not going to read all these numbers, you can examine the slide as we go along, compared to kids in more recent times, as well as young girls for the same period. And if you're looking at height, weight, body mass index, the summary of all of this is that Canadian children today are taller, heavier, fatter, rounder, weaker, less flexible, and less aerobically fit than they were in 1981. And the public health officials, the Canadian Pediatric Society, and many other groups are particularly concerned about this and are saying that this is the first generation in history that will grow up to be less healthy and not live as long as their parents. And this is a concern. So what is driving this? I'm going to suggest technology, online life has been a part of the problem. And I'm wondering for how many of you recognize that before cell phones and social networks, this is how we figured out where our friends were. We looked in the hood where all the bicycles were, and that's where the kids were. Nowadays, that sign, that signal, that clue is not as readily available. And it's true that kids are not spending as much time outdoors as they used to. In fact, this study suggests that 1 out of 2 children spend less than 1 hour each day outdoors. And this group have compared that to free-range chickens for some reason that spend 12 hours each day outdoors. And while this may be a humorous comparison, the point is children are not spending sufficient time outdoors to support base requirements for physical activity, which are a huge component of their health and well-being and development. We know from research and from studies done, this one in the UK, that the home territory of 8-year-olds has reduced year by year, by generation by generation. And this study focuses on 4 generations of the same family in England. Great-granddad at 8 years of age in the years 1919 was allowed outdoors with a range of about 6 miles under his own recognizance where he liked to go fishing. 1 generation later, his son, grandfather, was allowed about a mile, and his favorite activity was to venture off into the woods. His daughter, the mother, in 1979 was permitted a half a mile free range to go to the swimming pool. But the son today is allowed 300 yards, and that's really, he's allowed to go to the end of his street. And one has to be very concerned about this if you advocate for free range outdoor children. And at the very least, you've got to ask the question, why? What has changed over 4 generations that would drive this situation where kids are not allowed outdoors under their own recognizance to experience their neighborhoods and their environment and to be engaged with that particular environment? We also know active and safe routes to school are being promoted as a way to get kids active and to experience some aerobic activity. But the proportion of Canadian kids who walk to school has dropped by half since 1985. And only 1 in 3 kids, excuse me, now walk or cycle or wheel to school. This should be a concern for us, again, because kids need to be in the outdoors for physical activity. They also need to be in these kinds of activities where they learn to negotiate their environment safely, whether that's cycling, whether it's walking or wheeling, but it's negotiating street crossings, traffic, etc. We believe that a surplus safety is harming child development, and too many parents have limited their child's outdoor experience because there have become this generation of bubble wrap, anxious parents. Our contention is that they need to recognize that they can be good parents and allow their children freedoms within their child's own competencies to be outdoors and to face some risks. And yes, that includes some risks of physical injury, but they need to be allowed to play. Our contention is that play is the work of children. And my question of all of you who work full time, meaning 7 or 8 hours a day, my question is, are the kids whose job it is to play, are they getting 6, 7, 8 hours play a day? We already know that from one study, only 1 out of 2 children spends less than 1 hour, which is hardly close to full-time, quote, work. So what is play? This is rhetorical because we're not in a workshop setting, but how would you describe and/or define child play? And I think if I could ask you to stick your hands up and give me responses, many of you would tell me play is by definition a spontaneous activity. It's not sport that is organized and follows a set of rules in a particular environment. Play, by its very definition, is a spontaneous activity, and it is internally motivated by the child for their own pleasure, their own enjoyment, their own imagination, their own challenge, their own facing of what risks they might see in the activity. But this is key, that it is spontaneous and internally motivated. So what is risky play? Ellen Sandseter in Norway has done a tremendous amount of work in her PhD dissertation and in her research work since then, looking at risky play. And her definition says that it is the thrilling and exciting forms of play that involve uncertainty and, yes, a chance of some physical injury to a child. When we ask children to describe the feelings and ideas around risky play and the type of play that gives them excitement and uncertainty. They say it's thrilling, but they get a little bit scared. You know, it's scary and fun at the same time. That excitement that children have. One of them's described that it gives me tickles in my tummy, but I love it and I do it because it's scary and fun at the same time. The definition that Ellen has offered is that risky play is the type of play that happens at speed, that happens at height, that can involve dangerous tools, and by this we mean hammer, nail, saw. It's that involves dangerous elements, and you see the couple of kids here experimenting with lighting a fire, but it can be with water and so on. And it does involve rough and tumble play. There's a significant body of research that suggests that young children like to grapple, and it's a part of their healthy development that they do this. And I think if we reflect on many institutional rules right now, the very sight of two children engaged in that kind of rough and tumble play evokes an immediate response from the adults who come and put a stop to it, believing that it's bullying or it's going to lead to injury. When in fact this is a natural form of play that children spontaneously and voluntarily engage in. Risky play also includes the chance of getting lost. And let me qualify that. When children describe what they mean by getting lost, they mean that they play environments that are, quote, secret to them, that they can be in behind a bush or behind a tree and no one can see them, or at least that's what they think. Getting lost is in their own definition, and it's just that private place where they can go with their own thoughts to play. Now, as injury prevention people, I want to emphasize that risky play is not neglect, it's not recklessness, and it's not promotion of hazards or hazardous spaces. And let's just look at the difference here. You can see clearly in the picture on the left, and both pictures are slides of a sort, the picture on the left is clearly a hazard to a child that may not recognize the almost certain case of being injured if they slid down that particular slide, which is in poor repair. However, on the other side, where injury is not likely to occur because of a hazard, the slide is risky. It creates that experience of excitement for children, the tickle in the tummy, the speed, the height, the bits that they like to do in order to challenge themselves to engage in risky play. We, as injury prevention experts and people concerned for the welfare of children, have in the past tried to create a situation where we have an environment as safe as possible. Mariana and I and others would advocate, we don't think it's necessary, it's reasonable, nor is it required to create environments as safe as possible. What we want is as safe as necessary so that children don't suffer particularly serious traumatic injuries, but that they do experience some risk and they do allow themselves to be challenged, and that the environment is not boring to them. Too many children describe many play environments that they're in today as boring, and they get fed up with it because it doesn't challenge them and it doesn't excite them. So let's just spend a minute on what exactly is risk. How do you define risk in the context of child play? And what are the key influencers of risk? So we've spent some time considering what risk is. The old perspective used to say that risk is about the chance or the probability of a loss, the chance of a probability of an injury. However, we're advocating a new perspective on risk, which is really about the effects of uncertainty on your objectives. So if the objective is to enjoy play, it's about the uncertainty that it could end well or could end not so well. And we've put that within a framework here, that a child holding a hammer, which many might regard as a really risky thing and you shouldn't have that in your hands, we would say actually that child holding the hammer is neither risky or not. It's entirely neutral. What we need to focus on is the outcome of the child with the hammer, which could be both negative or positive. And the positive outcomes could be that a child learns how to manage a hammer, learns how to hit a nail and drive it into a piece of wood, and they feel a great sense of accomplishment having done that. And they might do that with some guidance from adults or peers who are already experienced and competent at that activity. On the other end, there may be potential negative outcomes if some of the guidance and if some of the peer support isn't there. However, we do not focus on the particular activity because the activity is risk-free. It is the outcome that is the definition of whether the activity was risky or not. It's based upon the outcome. So we want to convince you that some risk is good for children. And I'm going to spend a little time here on what the benefits of risky play are. So there are lots of studies in the literature, and you can see some of the articles that I've chosen over the years about the developmental benefits of risky play. So the picture shows a child challenging themselves to walk along the log. It's a bit slippery, it's a bit mossy. It could represent risk in terms of an activity that could end well or not. But there are very healthy outcomes that can be achieved for this kind of activity. First of all, physical and motor competence is improved. Kids who engage in this kind of active play and outdoor play and challenge themselves gain muscle strength, they improve in balance and coordination, and their reaction time is improved. They also develop greater spatial orientation. And by that, they develop what's called a kinesthetic sense. They're better aware of their body and body parts in space. And if this child did slip off that log and headed towards the forest floor, they're much more likely to be able to orient themselves to a safe landing than a child who has not previously experienced this kind of activity nor practiced it. It's also important that children experience benefits around object depth, height, speed, and the ability to adjust. And if I translate this to an activity that you may be well aware of, and one where safety is much more enhanced in children who've experienced outdoor risky play, and that is crossing the road in traffic. Children who've been exposed to outdoor risky play are better able to gauge the speed of an oncoming car and determine whether they have time to cross the road ahead of the car. And those who haven't had the same experiences, they're not as good at judging the speed of an oncoming car. And when we've looked at this in virtual reality settings, many of those kids without that experience and play practice get run over. And so, testing in a laboratory situation helps us understand that risky play and play outdoors is important to this very safe, or being safer in that particular activity. They develop as well environmental competence. Being out in nature gives kids a sense of purpose, self-worth, self-reliance, competence, resilience. And I live in a community in Maple Ridge in BC that has an outdoor school. There is no building at all for this school. Kids meet in the natural environment every day at a predetermined site, and they take all of their curriculum in the outdoors. Rain or shine, they do math, English, biology, whatever it is, in the outdoors. And all of those kids demonstrate much more resilience, much more self-worth, much more self-efficacy and sense of purpose than kids in other schools that go to the classroom every day. So there are great benefits for kids being outdoors. Exposure to risky play by children on their own terms according to their own competencies helps reduce fear through natural gradual exposure. The photo in this picture, this little guy challenged himself every day to go a little higher on the spiderweb climbing frame. And of course, after a certain period of time, here he is at the top. It also allows kids to improve their risk perception and decision making. This young man did not progress beyond a level that he was comfortable and competent in going beyond, and he did that on his own terms and according to his own decision making. No one was stopping him, and no one was over encouraging him. This was his own plan according to his own competence. But he got to the top and overcame his fears of climbing this. We know that risky play improves executive functioning. And of course, executive function in the brain is the master decision maker. And we can see that kids who spent time in too many structured activities had a reduction in self-directed executive functioning, while those kids who were in reduced structured activities had greater self-directed executive functioning. Now, this is important. Executive function is that master decision maker. It recognizes situations, circumstances, and makes decisions that are healthy and beneficial for the kid. Overly structured lives and activities take away from that. And I'm certain that none of us are in the business of trying to limit a child's development and executive functioning progress. And we also know that kids want to take risks. A study of 11 to 14-year-olds in England looked at the kids, and overwhelmingly, they described an area that they lived in as pretty risky. And they wanted their local area to be made safer, but they wanted more interesting things to do. Their most popular places to play were wastelands, building sites, underpasses, rivers, abandoned buildings, and like this photo, jumping into the water-filled quarry. But that they wanted their play to be away from adults so that they can challenge themselves, make their own discoveries, and enjoy their own excitement. Again, this is the challenge to find a balance between what kids want as challenges and exposure to risk in an environment where it's not hazardous, but it includes the risk. And we know when kids are not allowed to challenge themselves and be exposed to competency-based risks throughout their growing up, then some of them, as older children, end up taking unhealthy risks because the lack of exposure early in their life has limited their master decision making, has limited their experience in risk taking, limited their practice in healthy risk taking, and many of them engage in unhealthy risk taking. So this study looked at 360 children, 12 to 16, most of whom did engage in healthy risk-taking. But when we looked at a subset of that group who had over-restricted parents, had limited opportunities, were low SES, they had not had the same practice, same opportunities, and their risk-taking was more unhealthy and resulted in things like petty crime, drinking, speeding, early sex, and going into places that were definitely hazardous and unsafe, trying to satisfy the need for excitement and risk without the ability to measure that through executive functioning. So what does the evidence say about this? So Mariana and a group of colleagues looked at the relationship between risky outdoor play and health in children. And if you know what a systematic review is, what they did was to look at worldwide all relevant literature and analyze that literature connectively to come out with the overall understanding of what healthy outdoor risky play means to kids' health. And what they found was when kids engage in outdoor risky play, they have increased physical activity. That seems to make sense. They have decreased sedentary behavior. That seems to make sense as well. They had increased cardiorespiratory fitness, and there was no effect on motor skills, though they did acknowledge that specific motor skills were not well measured in these particular studies. But the point here is not one study, not one of them out of 1,000 or more, reported any negative effects of children playing in the outdoors in, quote, a risky environment. So what we see here is a bit of a paradox. Keeping kids safe in terms of their healthy development means letting them take risks as young children according to their own competency. And we need to start doing that early. Now, what's the current situation in allowing kids to take that course of action in their play? Well, our view is, and the question is, are we as parents and caregivers overdoing things? You know, we are in a situation that we would contend that parents nowadays parent their own kids from an anxiety-based place. And if I'd asked you what the 3 biggest concerns of parenting are, I likely would have got this. We've tested this over and over and over. Parents are concerned about stranger danger, about their child being abducted by a stranger. They're concerned about the traffic and their kids getting hit by a car if they're allowed to go out and play on the street or walk or cycle to and from school. And they are very concerned about their child being injured. And I'm going to ask you to cast your mind back. These parents who are anxious of these 3 things are the same parents that played in all those places as kids, yet they're not affording their children today the same opportunities. So I'm just going to take a look at some of the evidence around these 3 concerns. And with respect to stranger danger, if we take the evidence and give this to parents who are scared that their kids are going to be taken off the street corner, in fact, There is no increase in child abduction since the 1970s when data was first collected. We've had one true stranger abduction in 2000, 2001. Most abductions are not strangers. They're taken by family members who are often in dispute or in marital crisis. But the adult that takes the child is known to the child. It's often a parent. And why wouldn't a child go with their parent? They trust them, they love them. It's their parent. The calculation, therefore, in terms of the risk of child abduction today is approximately 0.0005%. It is minuscule. And if you look at that, a child would have to be left outside unattended for approximately 750,000 years before a person unknown to that child came along and took them off the corner. This is the equivalent of a risk of 1 in 14 million. 1 in 14 million. And if any of you play this game, that's the same odds. The odds of winning Lotto 649 are about 1 in 14 million. And I would ask any of you on the phone how often you play Lotto 649 and have you ever won the jackpot? It's that remote. And parents who are very concerned about their child being out because of stranger danger and who keep them indoors, indoors is not as safe as they think. Greater exposure to cyber predators and cyberbullying because kids indoors are typically online. And even more increasingly nowadays, kids have a device in their hands at the end of their arm all the time. There's greater exposure to unhealthy snacks, worse air quality, increased sedentary behavior and inactivity. Indoors isn't as safe as many parents believe. When we look at the data for injuries, and this is work done by Sarah Richmond and group and published just a year or so ago, when they looked at Canadian mortality rates for all unintentional injuries by sex and age for kids 0 to 19 in Canada between 1950 and 2010 or 9, you can see the trend lines. One might argue that in Canada, it's never been safer. Those trend lines are pretty dramatic reductions over the year, and it's never been safer than it is today for both boys and girls. So one has to ask, where does the anxiety come from? Perhaps it's related to traffic injuries. So since 1985, the proportion of Canadian kids who walk to school has dropped by 50%. Yet 58% of the parents walk to school, but only 28% of their children walk to school today. Why? What's changed? It's never been safer, and the remoteness of being taken by a stranger is minuscule. When we look at, and I only have BC data, I'm sorry, but when I look at 14 years worth of data for 1 to 14-year-old kids, the number of deaths over 14 years has been 48, and the number of kids injured in cars has been 90, or died in car crashes has been 90. Why do I show you this data? Well, true, there are some injury deaths of kids who've walked to school over the last 14 years, but putting them in a car and driving them there is twice as risky. 90 versus 48. And the exposure calculations here are twice as much as well. So parents who believe it's safer to drive their kids to school don't recognize nor understand this data. When we look at cycling-related injuries, you can see again that both the number of hospitalizations because of cycling-related injuries over the years has come down by almost 60%, as has the rate. So it's not about a reduction in the number of kids who are cycling. It's a true decrease among the population of kids who cycle. We do have some separated infrastructure in British Columbia. And when we look at this, there are only 2 crashes per 100,000 cycling trips in our city. Again, it's a very small number of kids. And we have to ask, what is the balance between the health gained and the competencies gained allowing a kid to cycle in the outdoors versus the negative outcome of the risk of injury? Some more evidence on traffic deaths. I just showed you this, pardon me. So twice as likely to die as an occupant versus a pedestrian versus a cyclist, even more. So the evidence just is not in favor of parents putting their kids in cars to drive them to school or to the play space. It's much safer to allow them to walk or to cycle because the rates are much lower in terms of traffic injury risk of death. Almost 2 times more likely to die in a car and 5 times more likely to die than as a cyclist. When we look beyond deaths at traffic injury hospitalizations, you can see the number and rates here. But I'm going to show you that the vast majority of those 242 injuries were fractures. And these were what's called a Colles fracture, a lower arm wrist fracture, where the resilience of kids and the bounce back is, it's not a serious injury to them. Yes, there were 21 concussions and 12 head injuries, but these were among kids who didn't have a helmet on. So those might be expected. Motorcyclists as well, there were fractures, the vast majority, 1.4 head injuries, 1.2 concussions, a very small number. And yes, these kids were wearing helmets, but helmets don't always prevent the concussion particularly. Now, it's true that 4.5 times more likely to end up in a hospital as a cyclist than if you're in a car. But I would contend the reason you end up in a hospital is because you have a minor injury, relatively minor injury like a fracture, versus being in a car which resulted in a 5 times more likelihood of dying. So we have to ask, if we're allowing our kids to explore some risk situations, which end of that spectrum do we prefer? The evidence for outdoor falls as well has reduced by 46. The absolute numbers and the rates are both coming down. So kids outdoors who are falling are not dying, or the rates of death have come down considerably, as have the hospitalizations. And when we look again at the numbers of outdoor fall-related hospitalizations, let's focus on the 365 that involve playground equipment. So they were in the playground. Well, of 365, 332 were fractures. Again, lower forearm wrist fractures that represent just a minor injury to kids. They rebound from this injury very, very readily. There were 7 concussions. There were some more serious internal organ and dislocation injuries, but the vast majority of these were minor. And we have 634,000 children included in that population that resulted in the 365 injuries, most of which were minor. So again, the evidence is not in support of keeping your kid inside. Yes, there's some risk, but there's some risk everywhere. And the challenge for us to raise healthy children is, what risk are we going to assume, and what outcome do we prefer in terms of their healthy development? So, summarizing that fall-related injury, deaths from falls from play equipment in between 2000 and 2011 for 1 to 14-year-olds in BC, there was one death in 84 million kids playing in playgrounds, or 84 million kids playing in playgrounds. That, if you think about that 1 in 14 million, well, it's six times more likely that you'll win the lottery than it is a child would die from a fall on playground equipment based upon the past experience. And if we then take it out of the playground and look at more natural environment play spaces, the death rate for falls from trees for the same age group for the same period, 0, none, nada, zilch. There were none. So the risk of these particular issues in parents' mind, in our view, is just not supported by the evidence. Now, somebody's going to argue, Ian, these are population rates. How do you account for exposure? Like, how many of those kids are playing, and can you tell me what it is if you engage in those activities? There's much less research done in that area. But when we look at a systematic review that was completed on active commuting, sport participation, and leisure time, this is looking at the risk of medically treated injuries by exposure in terms of 1,000 hours engaged. And you can see that the rates are very small for active commuting, sport, and leisure time. And in fact, if we think about leisure, recreation, allowing a child to be outdoors under their own recognizance to play as they see fit, when you look at what 0.15 to 0.17 means in terms of 1,000 hours exposure, a child would need to play for 3 hours every day outdoors for 10 years before they experienced an injury, according to these odds. So the question then becomes for us, what are our strategies for change? And I love this poster from the Child and Nature Alliance. You know, childhood, for the best results, use outdoors. And it's a message that I've harped on. But it's true, the biggest risk that we have to a child's healthy development and their risk of injury in the long run is keeping them indoors. Because we want them to be outdoors to address risks according to their stage and competency. We don't want to keep them indoors. But when we let them out, we don't mean here. This is the famous kit, fence, carpet type play structure. And I just can't imagine the attraction of any child to that particular play site. What we mean is here. We know that when children are outside, they move more, they sit less, they play longer, and they derive numerous developmental and health benefits. If we're considering what outdoors within a risky play, within an outdoor environment that is institutionalized, school, daycare, that kind of thing, what can we do in that regard? Well, we can take a leaf out of the book of the Sydney Playground Project that occurred in Australia, and Anita Bundy led this particular stuff. They took everything away. They just had a flat play area, but they loaded it up with a bunch of play materials that were adaptable and usable by the kids. There were no rules about how this material was to be used, but it was there. And the kids, you can see from the photographs, how the kids then put it to use according to their own inventiveness, their own imaginations, and their own desires for challenge and play. We work with Susan Harrington, and she is a landscape architect who's looked at play spaces for children. That's her entire career. And the idea is that the highest quality spaces, first of all, are scaled to a child. And if we reflect back on a couple of slides that I've showed, children do this naturally for themselves. The young man who climbed the spider net scaled it on a daily basis to his own challenge, ability to meet that challenge, and his own competency. And Susan is very big on sensitivity to climate, so not too hot, not too cold. The idea is to design spaces that are just right for a child. And the highest quality spaces include natural living material, elements that a child can manipulate, and I just talked about the Sydney Playground Project, flexibility to allow imagination to shape their own play, and this includes spaces for both individual, thinking, getting lost, and group play, because kids are social beings. Now, what do we do about supervision of spaces like this that Susan designs? Well, this sign in a playground is just not one to my liking particularly. I think kids don't require the kind of supervision demonstrated by the female on the right here. First of all, her body posture is tense. She's arms folding. She's looking very concerned. And I wonder at the message that she's sending the little guy in the black t-shirt, about him climbing on this frame. I think it's like, oh, be careful, you're not ready for this, or it just sends a message that this kid doesn't have the competence to challenge himself on this. And we would advocate for a competence-based approach to supervision and care that are based upon a child's competence and needs rather than the caregiver's anxiety. And Omar has postulated something called vigilant care. And it does mean that parents are present, but it isn't parent control. And parents are asked to adjust their level of involvement, but based upon alarm signs that suggest that a child is beyond their level of competence. So what does this mean? And it's fashioned after the traffic light colors. So it's all good to go. A parent should be caring, provide interest, trust, openness, be non-intrusive, and they should provide this kind of supervision most of the time. At the playground, in outdoor play, whatever the activities are, most of the time. Focused attention should happen when there is a perception that there's some warning signs that a child may be beyond their own competence. And what that means is just to ask, are you sure you're okay with that? If the child improves, then you double back and you go back to open attention. The only time that active protection is needed is to take steps to reduce the risk when a child's beyond their competence and there's clear hazard or danger in front. But one should abstain from over-controlling messages and acts, and in all efforts try to get the child to see the problem and take their own corrective actions, and then you can move back to open attention. Now, I think kids understand this, and here's a sign that kids posted on an adventure playground in the UK. You're welcome to be here, adults. Just sit back, relax, we got this. This is our play space. So at the end of the day, our recommendations are that parents encourage their child to go to the outdoors, that they play spontaneously and according to their own challenges and their own competencies. And if this is about being an educator or a caregiver, embrace the outdoors for learning for socialization and physical opportunities in a variety of weather conditions. I spoke about the outdoor school in Maple Ridge, and I love the words of Norwegian caregivers at a particular daycare where Ellen studied. And the interviewer from North America asked them, but it gets really cold in Norway. Think prairie winter. And their response was, the kids are outdoors all the time, even in the cold. And they said, but what about the bad weather? Their response was, there is no bad weather, just inappropriate clothing. And I think for us, that's a different perspective on how we need to think about when kids can be outdoors. Our mantra is they can be outdoors at all times. And if you don't believe me, I'm going to have a little appeal to authority. Pope Francis has even commentated on this. He acknowledges that we can't control every situation that a child may experience, and nor should we. If parents are obsessed with always knowing where their children are and controlling all their movements, they will seek only to dominate space. This is no way to educate, strengthen, and prepare children to face challenges in the future. What is most important is the ability lovingly to help them grow in freedom, maturity, overall discipline, and real autonomy.
Thank you very much, Ian. And there is one question in the chat box. Many parents are concerned about being accused of neglect if they don't supervise the children outdoors constantly. How do you mitigate this?
To allow their children into the outdoors and to experience risk on their own terms according to their own competences. So I'm going to end there and say thank you very much for your time. I hope this has been useful. And Cara, I'll turn it back over to you now. Well, that's an excellent question, and I know that we have got a number of what can I call them? Concerned citizens who see children, and their first reaction is to respond according to those anxieties, and if they're not their own children, they phone the authorities, suggesting that that parent is negligent. Now, we've had a case in British Columbia where where a single dad with 3 children, ages 8, 10, and 12, he moved into a condo at the failure of his marriage with the children, and for 1 year every day, he went with those children and taught them how to use the public transit system to go from their home to school and home again safely as a group of 3. Shortly after he was satisfied that they were skilled and able, someone reported the 3 kids being alone on the bus, and this became a social services issue. The debate raged in the media for a little while, but I think public sentiment in the end was the report was made by an ill-informed busybody, and in fact this parent had taken every step to educate his children, and his children were had all of the competence necessary to do what they were doing. And so I think that the story sort of swelled and then it went away, and people who were far more considerate said, yes, indeed. Now, if a parent is unwilling to let their child go out on their own recognizance entirely alone, then I refer you to the Vigilant Care slide that says open attention, but sitting back and away. At a playground, I would encourage a parent, if they wish to be there, to sit back on the bench and observe their child enjoy the environment without standing right next to them without interfering with them, without encouraging or protecting them too much. When we have gone to playgrounds and observed children playing and parent interaction with those children, we conclude that parents seldom ever get it right. And I'm going to be overly sort of characteristic here, but typically what we see is mums are very protective and saying, don't go up there, don't, that's too high, come down, you're going to hurt yourself. And dads, on the other hand, are a bit over cavalier